Alright. So, for anyone here who's interested in level design, we always have to go back to some of the most boring topics towards the very end, because as we all know, level design is a fun thing to do once you're creative with it, and you're able to create a landscape or a interior that otherwise you thought wouldn't exist at the very beginning with the rough parts created by, say, a tile set, or with free assets that are free from a tile set, such as flora. So when we look at all this, it's all great and all, but we also have to worry about how it runs. So today I'm going to be teaching you how to optimize your dungeons so that they can actually work on lower rig systems, so you don't need a supercomputer to run your Skyrim mods. So simply off, we're going to talk about two types of optimization. We're going to be talking about the occlusion planes, and we're going to be talking about room bounding. Occlusion planes tends to be the more common one, where you will end up placing a plane from this little box here. And if I show markers, it should show up. Oh, case in point, let's use this as an example here. This cave here is a cave that I've developed. It's about 3,000 assets. So we have to be very careful how we handle certain things. So optimization is key because we don't want to render all of this at once all the time. All right. So to make it run faster, we'll work with things like occlusion planes. Now, occlusion planes benefits here is that you can put them anywhere, pretty much, except for areas where the player can go through. Because what happens is when you look through an occlusion plane, anything behind the plane is not visible. It's not rendered, which increases performance heavily when you're dealing with large chunks of a cave. And this benefits a little bit more with more open tile setups, where a tiled setup would actually benefit maybe a little bit more from a tile set being brought through with room bounding. Because room bounding, you have to work with the grid system a bit more, and occlusion planes, you work more off the grid with it. I will also get into more limitations of room bounding when we get to that part of the section of the tutorial. So as we're getting into here, we're going to click one of these things here, right? We're going to click the occlusion plane, and we're going to find said plane marker. And here it is. It's a very simplistic little piece here. All right. So we're going to have to resize this. But it's a very important little thing to make work. Now, before we do that, I'm going to get rid of this one that appeared because I had all my markers disappearing. And go back. You see it's titled Plane Marker. This allows me to move it around. When you first place it, it'll start letting you coordinate its size. But if you want to move it around first, you press 2 once more, and then you'll get to this. The issue here is it looks like it's not showing me the resize. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to refresh the cell. See if refreshing fixes the problem. If not, it is not fixing it. So unfortunately, I might actually have to restart the CK because the CK is a weird little mess sometimes. No, we're going to save plug into the file. So we're going to launch this. And yes, I have a Skywind background because though I'm a developer for Skyblivion, I like having some contrast when I look at things. So you get to look at the meat of how all this works. I'm going to have to set active file. Y'all can ask questions while it's loading. Anyone have questions towards occlusion planes in particular?
I do have a question. Oh, sorry.
No, you go first.
If I may. Are occlusion planes included in the open world, like the outside world in Skyrim?
You can use it in the exterior world space, yes.
I got you.
Usually what you'll end up doing is hiding those in walls and within trees and large mountains. So one way you can optimize Skyrim is, say, since it's covered in mountains, almost a massive proportion of its landscape,
Mhm.
you will use occlusion planes inside the mountains to make it to where it doesn't render anything behind the mountain.
Oh, that's it. Okay, so it goes inside things to keep
Yes.
the other stuff that you wouldn't even see otherwise. That makes more sense. Okay,
Exactly.
gotcha,
So what happens
gotcha,
is
gotcha,
it
gotcha.
stops things from rendering that you wouldn't even see. So without losing any kind of immersion, you're
Mhm.
increasing your performance.
That's awesome. Okay, that makes more sense. Gotcha.
Now you're seeing why initially the one thing what you're going to also notice if you work on a big project here on the side note is that CK will take forever to load a massive bit of data. Skyrim runs almost instantaneously. When you throw anything extra into the mix, it slows down a bit. So even with CK fixes on an SE plugin, it takes 5 minutes to load the references. So this is a waiting game, and I'm gonna have to do this one more time for Goblin Gems Cave when we not Goblin Gems, Veyond Cave when we're doing room bounding. This cave is optimal for teaching you occlusion planes, but it's not optimal for teaching you room bounding. Because room bounding has limitations that I've already said before, but there's a couple other ones that this one would cause a couple cardinal sins of room bounding. Case in point, room bounding and large water tiles do not mix well. If the center of your asset is not inside a room bound, it will not render. Does that make sense? So if anyone's ever checking their room bounding and their room bounding is not working properly because something is missing halfway, or part of your walls are missing, it's because your room bound is not encompassing the middle of the asset, which can cause issues with water tiles that expand over an entire cell. So we're now back to this. I'm gonna have to I have to delete all my previous occlusion planes. Alright, so this is a bare bones cave, no occlusion planes added to it, but we're gonna work with how we're going to interject it. So the idea is we want it to stay outside of the player's visible area. So what you're probably gonna have is occlusion planes go in between walls, through here, and if you have parts that pop out of a skylight, say in this area, you want to throw occlusion planes at the top here, and under some mountain pieces, so they don't render anything that's really not behind this. So we can really optimize this area to increase its performance to only hold maybe 500 to the 3,000 assets at a time. Alright? So, simply put, place an occlusion plane. Now, you're able to see the UI for this. We're able to expand it. And if I do this, get this going. This allows me to go in any direction I wish. I can shrink it, move it, depending on the arrow I work with. And this will let me move it back and forth. So, now that I have a plane that's like this, I'm going to take off by pressing 2, which will make it where the resize function's off. And I'm going to rotate this way. Now, the controls get a little finicky when you're dealing with this portion. But now, this, I should be able to do this, that. Allows me to not render anything above here. So if the player looks up, they don't render these trees. Now this is a very minor thing, but still, if I'm only loading 2 triangles from this NIF structure here, this portion here is stopping multiple polygons from being lifted from these trees, so every little bit helps. Then I can put another occlusion plane here. say here. All right. Press 2, rotate, rotate, put here. Outside of the player zone. So we can check by hiding the water here. You look through here, you don't see the occlusion plane. So we sometimes have to check inside the tile set that we've placed, or the entire dungeon that we've created, to see that things have not busted through what we're seeing. Now what this one will do is if I'm looking through here, it's not loading anything up here, which is a little bit more powerful than this one. Then we can use Control D to duplicate the occlusion plane. Rotate it. Welcome to the weird things of moving occlusion planes around. Let's nullify its rotation for a second. So we get that. Then we can say 90 on the Y. That is not what we want. So we'll go 90 here. There we go. So we have this kind of shape going for us. And we simply raise it up here. Where the player can't go. But when combined here and here, making sure they intersect a bit, what ends up happening is anything that this would not catch, this one will. And now, go back to the resize, extend, extend, extend. You get this system here. This will make it to where if they look down, they will not load anything down here. You can do that again here. By duplicating it, I can put it here. As long as it's not intersecting any part of the interior piece, I am able to do whatever I wish with these planes to stop things from rendering. Does anyone have any questions with this?
I might have what would seem a silly question. How come they don't sort of have like the occlusion plane built into the walls, so they kind of automatically, like if you wouldn't be seeing through it, they just automatically don't do that?
That's an engine thing.
Yeah, it's an engine thing? Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So like a modern gaming engine could have something like that.
Yeah. But remember,
Gotcha.
Creation Kit is a pretty outdated engine.
Oh god, yeah.
Other things. So we can intersect planes, as I stated before, which actually helps us a lot when we're covering more advanced pieces. So see how organic the structure is that I've built? You can cover it a bit more with these kind of tile sets. So I can expand here and here. Then when it gets to this portion, I'm going to duplicate this, raise it up. This is where it starts to flatten out. I'm going to take my flat one again, come down here, rotate, make sure it doesn't clip through the entire place again. And then expand, resize. So technically, it's a very simple process you go through for the tops and bottoms, and it's even simpler when you're dealing with the side to sides because you don't have to rotate them. Case in point, We save the progress because this is actually a lot better than my previous optimization. So let's say I throw an occlusion plane here. Drag it over here so we can see what we're doing. I can now, this is where the big optimization saves are. So we get this here and here. Reduce it a little bit. We can always edit it after the fact to keep it fine-tuned. And because this is not going to interject anything here, we can actually do something like this. And then get an aerial perspective. And move it. So even though it's not in here and you see none of the occlusion planes are inside the dungeon, what they're doing is every time you view, say you view from here, nothing behind this will render, nothing up here will render. You're not seeing it. Nothing up there, back here would render. It allows for me to only load a select few objects that the player's actually seeing. Does this make sense for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Alright. So this is occlusion planes in general. You don't really deal with them in a more complicated setup than angling them. Angling them is honestly the worst part. And every once in a while, your orientation changes. So the bulk of what we're going to be talking about is room bounding. And room bounding is a little bit different, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But what I'm going to tell you, one last thing, is there's another type of occlusion other than an occlusion plane called an occlusion cube. What this one will do, though, is what's inside the cube is not rendered by anyone looking outside the cube. All right? So this can be used to hide all your little traps and goodies. So this is your occlusion cube. Say we place the occlusion cube here. All right? So we got an occlusion cube. Let's raise it up for everyone to see. Anything inside the cube cannot be seen unless you're inside the cube. So we can hide quest events in these little things. We can hide actors that we don't want to be found here. We can hide traps that we don't want people to see so it doesn't look unimmersive when rocks are floating in the sky. So if we have all these little things involved, an occlusion cube is the best way to hide those elements until they are needed. Especially when we apply havoc and they will fall out of said occlusion cube. But they can also cause some lighting issues. So it's a little bit of time that you need to put into it in order to make it work the best way possible. But it's another tool at your disposal. Alright. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to load my Veyond Cave ESP so I can work with you on room bounding. Because room bounding is the harder part of optimization. You will see it sometimes when it involves a house. You'll see it sometimes when you're actually dealing with more tile-friendly dungeons. And you won't see it in circular dungeons because room bounding involves rectangular prisms that touch each other just right. So you have to work on a grid. So understanding how tiles work will help you understand how room bounding works. And given the previous limitations, knowing this, we can't use something like the Imperial Palace as an example of using room bounds because the Imperial Palace, by its very foundation, is circular. So rectangular prisms and circles do not work well together. But that doesn't mean you can't use it for some other organic structures as long as you have lenience. And I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to work on one or two little showing you how to connect it, but I'm not going to go fully in depth on how I did it for Veyond Cave because it is more than 30 minutes of work to get these things right when you first start doing. So I'm going to go over and explain how these things come to be and how I actually made it work. So as it's loading, anyone have any other questions involving occlusion planes?
Yeah. Do you when does it decide whether to render an object based on whether its origin is behind the plane or whether all the object bounds are all within the plane?
Basically, if any object is behind, like if the entire object is behind the plane, it does not render.
Okay, so the whole thing has to be behind the plane.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
All right.
Didn't placing it into like placing objects into the occlusion cube or behind an occlusion plane cause like flickering?
Yeah, that's what
I-
I said by lighting issues.
Yeah, and
It's possible to cause those problems.
I also noticed when hiding trees with occlusion planes that this didn't work because it clipped out of it from some angles.
Yeah, that's the issue with depending on the bigger trees you can fit a couple,
Hmm.
like one or two, but the very thin trees you really can't. So you have to really work with cliffs a lot more often when you're dealing with landscapes.
Ah,
Also,
sense.
if you have protruding walls of like a fort, those are easily able to handle occlusion planes as well. So what you're really looking for in occlusion planes is areas that players can't see behind, and it tends to be a large position. So room bounding is a little bit different, and this one is more annoying to some than others. And first off, you'll understand that something's room bounded and why it's a little bit more annoying in the CK, because if you look at my CK right now, you see no room bounds. That's because the CK hides all room bounds by default. So if I go to view and then show hide window, portals and rooms, close. This is what a room bounded cave looks like. Now I'm gonna break down what you're seeing here. All right, every one of these rectangular prisms is a room bound. Every little square you see between two room bounds is a portal. All right, and you see this is an organic structure. It's not necessarily a tiled system, but you're still able to room bound it with a little bit more time and practice. Anyone have questions involving the style of room bounding before we get into the nitty-gritty of how it works?
I actually have one more question about occlusion planes that might be relevant to this as well.
All right.
Do you have to consider like how close the plane comes to where you could get around it? Like if it's in a wall, if it's too close to the edge of the wall, could the player come around the wall and see stuff loading in?
If part of the occlusion plane clips through the walls, there will be issues. But as long as you make sure that it stays outside of the walls and doesn't clip through them, you're fine.
Thanks.
Because essentially what happens is if it stays outside of the player's like workable location, there's never going to be a point where the player walks where they will actually see the occlusion plane inside its level. All right? It is the outside player of optimization. All right? Now, room bounding is a bit different because as you see, one side or multiple sides will actually clip through the entire dungeon. And this is because what we end up doing is each rectangular prism is their very own room, and these portals will actually connect these two rooms together. So as long as you're looking through the portal, everything renders through the portal what you're seeing. All right? But the portal kind of works as the opposite of an occlusion plane. All right? Essentially, if you look through the portal, only what you're seeing through the portal currently in this view is loaded, meaning stuff to the side over here isn't. All right? And so when you look around, things will render more as you're looking over. So this is a very great form of, or it's a greater form of optimization than an occlusion plane first off, but there are some hiccups. If you are able to intersect your viewpoint between multiple room bounds at one time, it'll cause performance loss. And this is a very unfortunate side effect towards how room bounding works. So what you'll end up doing is room bounding and people's dungeon design overall works best when it's fragmented. You see how I have multiple bins in my dungeon. I don't keep it linear. Doing so makes room bounding and subsequently all forms of optimization much easier to handle, as well as making it look more organic for the player to run through. Does this make sense for everyone? If not, feel free to ask. Alright, so technically what happens with the room bound is we created a grid style. So we're using the 64 by 64 units, that Skyrim units that were mentioned beforehand by Zix. And this will allow us to make things touch only at its very edge, because we don't want room bounding to intersect each other. We only want them to meet at their terminus. In doing so, we're able to interject a plane in between like where the terminus is of each, and then connect them. So off to the side, I'm going to do two room bounds and show you how to set up portals for them. So first off, you're going to need an asset. I'm going to put on the grid so we can actually handle this properly. So what's going to end up happening, and I'm going to use a simple pillar. This is one of my favorites to use as an example, is pillar LO3. It is one of my favorite pillars. You'll see it in almost every one of my dungeons that have cave elements. It is a beautiful Skyrim asset that's been retextured for Skyblivion. So, I'm going to move it around a little bit so it stays on the grid as proper. And then I'm going to click leave it's this one. All right. If you have the asset selected, what this ends up doing is it'll cover the entire asset, and which is what's really important here is we understand the units, because it's going to follow Skyrim units. And if your asset's not exactly in Skyrim units, it causes other issues. So you kind of want to understand how the system works, because it's going to surround the entire asset it works with. What you're going to end up doing now is, if we move it to the side, we can now resize as needed. Now, essentially, a room bound by itself, if it stands like this, the pillar will not be rendered inside the room bound because of the limitation that the center of the asset, where the focal point of Blender has put it in, has to be focused on this. So if the focal point of the pillar is in the center here, or at the base center, the line here is not going through the center of this, so this will not render, which will cause some rendering issues. This will cause gaps in your walls that you wouldn't want. And that's kind of unfortunate. So what you end up doing is either, one, moving it so it encompasses it, or you move the pillar in instead to make sure that it runs in the room you want it to. Now, this also causes issues for water tiles. If the center of the water tile is not inside the room bound, it will not render the top of the water. It'll still register you as underwater if you meet the parameters, but it will not render the surface. And this can cause a lot of problems when you're dealing with massive water dungeons. So if you're dealing with massive water dungeons and a massive water tile is actually taking care of 90% of your space, room bounding is probably not for you. You'll probably be using occlusion planes, as I had to do for the fourth cell of this cave, which was completely underwater. So now I'm going to show you how to connect this with another room bound. I can select the asset again and create another room, move it on, resize it, move it, and you see now that I'm snapped to grid, it actually connects right at the edge. I can now resize it again, do this, and now we have this kind of space. Now let's say the door is about the size of this pillar. All right. So we kind of want to connect both of these without having the full space being the window or the portal between the two rooms. All right. So what you're going to do is you want to make a portal only the space of the doorway, so it doesn't render anything don't want rendered at a time. All right, because this is optimization. We want to reduce all the assets we can while keeping the same level of quality. So what's going to end up happening is you select one, you press the P button, then you select the other, and it'll place a portal in between. Notice it only put the portal for the first one. You'll still have to reconnect the portal to the second. And so what ends up happening here is, if you look through this spot, you can see into this room while being in this room. So all of this is rendered, and only what you can see through this is rendered. And that's how portals will work. Now, to make this work, I'm going to have to hide this, and so I can select this portal here. So we're gonna go to this. This is the portal marker. Yep. All right. This portal marker is going to have to get. We're going to have to add a second one to the list here. We're going to have to select both at the same time using Control-Click, and then we're going to link it using this one. This will link a portal to the second room. And so now this portal, since it's linked to both rooms, if you're looking through this, it'll render this room from what it can see. Does anyone have any questions regarding this?
Sounds good.
All right. So now I'm going to apply this little piece of information to the rest of this cave. One of the things you're going to have to do when you're dealing with your cave is how small do you want your room bounds? The smaller the room bounds, the less assets that are loaded, but at the same time, the more chances errors can occur. If you're dealing with large water tiles, you might have to deal with larger room bounds if you're doing room bounds at all. So case in point, I have a lot of effects inside this hallway. And effects and room bounds sometimes don't mix well. So I end up trying to make this work the way that it needs to handle it. So I kept the entire hallway as one room. Then this room is probably one of the most detailed rooms of this entire cell. So I restricted this to being one room by itself. And later on, I'm probably going to inject some occlusion planes around here, because you can actually combine both forms of optimization together to optimize it further. So it doesn't render anything above here until they're looking at the skylight itself. So they can see the level of detail from here, but not here, because it's not needed. You can set it at odd angles here, so you can have a portal here and a portal here to make it work, but only as far as your pathway actually needs. So this only renders part of your level, instead of the portal rendering all of this portion or all of this portion at once. Also, if you limit how far your portals go, it also increases the performance, because what will end up happening is it reduces the amount of times you can look through one portal and intersect with another portal, which makes you render multiple rooms at once, which causes frame rate issues. So only put a portal for what you actually need it to go through. Otherwise, you can do the exact opposite of what you're trying to do, which is make it run better for anyone who has lower tier hardware, or just run better overall because Skyrim's engine's a bit outdated and can't handle everything that we kind of want it to. So what this will look like in game, for a perspective, would be you're in here, all of this will not load. All right. If you're not looking through here, this won't load. So if you're running through this, going around here, well, as soon as you go here, this portion loads. It's at an odd angle here, so this portion will not load for them either until they get to about here. Once they get to about here, they can start seeing the portals here. So this will begin loading. But at the same time, they're looking away from this one, so this one will unload. and this detail will unload. So it creates a lot more interesting little ways to optimize your cave to run at a higher FPS than it would by itself. Any questions overall? Yes.
Pedro.
Yeah.
Pedro, I might have missed it, but did you go over multi-bounds at all?
No, multi-bounds I did not, fortunately.
Okay.
I'm actually unclear on multi-bounds myself. If anyone has a lesson for that, I would definitely participate in that. But the two,
I know they're
like the most
usually a
common
special
ones,
case issue. But
Yeah. most common tends to be room bounds, occlusion planes, and occlusion cubes.
What are multi-bounds?
If I remember correctly, I think they were used for scripting a bit. In certain regions used a certain way, but I could definitely be wrong.
I don't know what they are, so, and I'm a scripter, so.
Yeah. So we're all just sitting here like, huh. It's
I
one of
know-
those,
I
like,
know
they
it.
highlight a lot of houses. You'll see them as, like, the purple and green cubes around houses most of the time when you look inside an actual city. So the question is what they're for.
So multi-bounds you can set per object. So like if you have one object that's it's not necessarily seen through like one portal from one room to the other. You can add, or you can set that object to have two multi-bounds, so it'll be bound to both rooms. So you can see it through both rooms.
So it can run in both rooms without a problem.
Mhm. Yeah. So if you
Oh.
were, I think it's usually a use case for caves, but if you were to like double click a pillar, and I think it has its own tab. Maybe I can't remember, but if you
Yeah, it
double
has
click a
its own
pillar
little
and then
tab. I
look
believe
through,
it's
Yeah.
up here somewhere. There it is, multi-bound PM. But essentially, could that actually be used for water tiles then?
yeah, it should. Yeah, you can set. I think a maximum of like that big water tile. You'd be able to set multi-bounds. I think from 2 rooms, so it'll be like in the original room, and then you can set it to also show up in another room.
The good news is I only have one room where I have the room bound where they actually can go to the surface of the water.
Yeah.
So I only need to render the top, so that would actually work in the long run. But I've already optimized the hell out of it. I don't need to go do it again with a different format. So again, we all learn. Yes, I'm gonna have to delete both of these. Oops, let's undo that. Oh yeah, one. I had it partially hidden. It's not. I can.
I have a question.
All right.
When do you use all this stuff? Like, should you do this
Oh.
for every dungeon, or is there a certain size, or?
Essentially what I would do if your dungeon is more than 2 rooms, I would suggest optimizing it a bit because we don't know what kind of rig the people who download our mods will be or will have. So we could get someone who's running a 3060, or we could get someone who's running a 670 on the NVIDIA side, and we don't want that. We don't want them to have issues where the 3060 has no problems. It's kind of like the whole open cities debate in a lot of areas. A lot of people like open cities, but that's because they can handle it on a higher tier rig. But there are a lot of people who will have massive performance issues because open cities is going to render a lot more things in terms of items. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. So basically, you have to do it a lot just to make sure everyone can play your dungeon.
Yep. Consider the person's rig who downloads this is a cheapo kind of computer. So within like the $500 range. I'm not saying integrated. We're not saying like the integrated graphics. We're talking about like the bare minimum graphics card. So like the minimum requirements for Skyrim Special Edition. We
Yeah.
want to make sure that people with the minimum requirements can actually play the mod without issues.
Okay, thank you.
and that's where optimization comes in.